Hi everyone, welcome to class number 3. Today we're going to be going over our introduction to childhood development. You should have read chapter 1 for this lecture. The topics that we will cover in class today are childhood development, the developmental periods, and theoretical perspectives. Our learning objectives are listed here. So as we think about childhood development, what I want you to do right now is to think about these 3 statements, and I want you to acknowledge if you agree or if you disagree with each of these statements. So number 1 is wounds of childhood scar people for life. So do you agree with that statement or do you disagree? 2, children and adolescents who fail to make eye contact with adults are devious and disrespectful. 3, adults are smarter than adolescents, adolescents are smarter than elementary school children, and elementary school children are smarter than preschoolers. So do you agree or disagree? So when we think about the study of childhood development, when we coin this word childhood development, we say that it's a way to identify and explain in the physical, cognitive, and social emotional development of the child. So when you think about this child in your future classroom, we're thinking about them in 3 ways. Okay, so we have this whole child, but we're dividing it into 3 different ways to view this child. Their physical development, their cognitive development, and their social emotional development. And we're going to learn more about that. As you're reading this book, you should be actively engaged with learning how children think, feel, and act at various stages in their development. And then you can take that knowledge and be able to help the children in your future classroom succeed because you know about their development. So when we talk about the origins of the field of childhood development, there's 2 individuals that stick out. So the first one is John Locke. And what John Locke essentially believed is that human beings are born as blank slates and they learn from their senses. So an example that I like to give for this is that you have a toddler and the toddler's in the kitchen while mom's cooking and mom turns her back. The toddler reaches up and touches the top of the stove and they burn their hand. They learn extremely quick from their sense of touch that the stove was hot and it hurt them. Okay, so previous to that, they had a blank slate about the stove. Now they've learned that when they touch the stove and it's very hot, it burns them and it hurts them. So they've learned not to do that, okay, from their sense of touch. So that's an example to help you remember what John Locke believed. So we also have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which I also refer to as JJR. And what he believed is that children were good actors and made decisions if they were to explore their surroundings and develop critical thinking skills from those experiences. So an example I would give for that is if you have a child who's outside and it has snowed for the first time. There's a lot of beautiful white snow in the yard and the sun comes out and that child has maybe a snowball in their hand and they're learning that when the sun hits the snow, it starts to melt. So they're developing critical thinking skills from that experience. So that's an example for JJR. Now, there are some essential features when we start talking about development. So when we think about any changes that a child experiences from the time they're born all the way up to adolescence, we know that these changes are progressive. So as the child gets older and older and older, we know they're progressing with different developmental changes. We also know that these changes are persistent and that they're cumulative. So when we think about the changes going from progressive to persistent to cumulative, they're all based on 4 factors throughout the child's life, which are existing conditions, nature and nurture, and the child's activity level. So as we look at this table right here, we can see these 4 conditions, okay? So the first one is any existing conditions. So that's the allowance of new possibilities from the brain, the body, and the psychological states. So for example, as a child's body begins to mature, they're going to be able to do more things physically. So as a child, when they're an infant, they are supposed to have tummy time. So when a child is on their stomach, they're working on the muscle development. So their muscles are getting stronger and they're learning to pick up their head. And then they're learning to move their arms and their legs into a position that helps them to be able to crawl. Okay, so that's an existing condition with their body. Their body has to mature more. Their muscles have to become stronger for them to be able to crawl. We also look at nature and nurture. So nature is that genetic inheritance, whereas nurture is your physical environment, nutrition, and interpersonal relationships. And then also the child's activity. So child's activity are choices and behaviors that influence new and changing states that the child will experience. So a child who is more active and who likes to go explore, they're definitely going to start learning things at more of a rapid rate versus that child who's subdued and who's very shy and doesn't like to get out and explore. So within the context of childhood development, something that's really important for you to write down or to know, so if you're taking notes, I encourage you to write down these 3 domains, okay? And they're physical, cognitive, and social emotional. So when we think about a child in a physical sense, these are concerned with biological changes that a child experiences in their body. So we're talking about genetics, we're talking about brain development, the acquisition of motor skills. So for example, learning how to walk. The next domain is cognitive. These are age-related transformations that occur in reasoning, concepts, memory, language, and intellectual skills. And then we look at social emotional. And those are the child's emotions, their self-concept, their motivation, their social relationships, and their moral reasoning. And as we go through this book, all 3 of these domain areas are going to be explored in deeper detail. But what's really important for you to know is that there are 3 domains that we look at within childhood development. Now, all 3 of these areas are dependent upon context. So when we think about context, we're thinking about the child's home, their school setting, their neighborhood, possibly daycare, maybe even like if the family is really involved in a church, another context could be church. Also, we're looking at culture. So it's really important to look at the child's culture. What does their family value? What traditions are there? Are there any symbols represented for this family? Okay, so your context and your culture are very impactful on these 3 domains of the child's development. Now, what we're going to do is an activity, and this is how I'm going to judge if you participated in today's lecture. You're going to get 10 points for completing this activity. So on Moodle, I have some handouts for you, and I've taken screenshots so you can see what those look like. So you can see the first handout I have for you is handout 1.2, and what it is a bunch of words. So you're going to see all of these words. Typically in class we would be doing a sorting activity, but because this is virtual, I'm going to have you type. So you're going to pull up the second handout that looks like this over here, and you are going to be typing in the words from handout 1.2 into the different domain categories. So I have done 3 of them for you, okay? So I sorted them: cognitive problem solving, physical walking, and social emotional self-esteem. Now, as you do this, there's not necessarily a right or wrong. Like, you're going to look at one word and you're going to think, oh yeah, that's definitely physical. But some of the words you're going to see could overlap. So I don't want you to get stuck in this mindset that there's a right or a wrong. I want you to sort the words where you personally feel that they should go. You need to make sure you sort all of the words into 3 categories. Then, after you sort all of your words, and when I say sort, what I mean is that you're typing them into these 3 different columns, you're going to go to the bottom of the page, and you're going to pick one word from each domain, and then you're going to give me an explanation. So I did one for you as an example. So for the physical category, I chose the word walking, and my explanation is I put walking into the domain for physical because this is a large motor movement that children learn in their physical development. Most children learn to walk between 13 and 15 months of age. Now, you might not necessarily know when a child learns to walk. I don't expect you to do any kind of research for your explanation. I just want you to tell me simply why you put that in that category. You're only going to do one word for each category. After you've completed this activity, you're going to upload it on Moodle. So there's a place for you to upload your document. And I want you to make sure you complete this activity before you go on with our lecture. Okay, so there are 3 developmental issues that we're going to learn throughout this text. The first one is on nature versus nurture. The second has to do with universality versus diversity. And then we're looking at qualitative versus quantitative changes. And we're going to explore those today. So the first issue is nature versus nurture. So when we think about nature, those are inherited characteristics that influence a child's growth. They're common traits and individual differences in children, right? Not one children is alike. Even if you have twins who were, excuse me, even if you have twins, those twins, even if they look the exact same physically, they're going to be different, okay? They're different children. Within nature, we look at this word temperament. Okay, this is an important term for you to remember. Temperament is a way of responding to emotional events, novel stimuli, and impulses. So you might have a child who's very hot-tempered. You have another children that takes a toy from them and they just get extremely angry extremely fast. Whereas you might have another child who's just super laid back, and that same child goes and steals a toy from that child, and that child's just like, whatever, it doesn't bother me, I'm just going to go play with something different. Okay, so different children have different temperaments. Another important term is maturation. That's the genetically guided changes that occur over the course of development. So you're going to mature as you grow in different ways. Now, when we look at nature versus nurture, nurture has to do with the child's development through multiple channels. So we're looking at how are they nurtured socially, intellectually, and psychologically. Okay. So I have a video right here that explains nurture and nature, and I would like for you to watch that video. I have the link posted on Moodle, so I want you to pause the lecture video right now, and I want you to watch the video, and this will help you better understand nature versus nurture. Now, after you've watched the video, something that can help you remember this is that nurture is environmental, where nature is genes. Okay, so these are 2 ways to remember this, because easily we can flip these terms and it might be hard for you to remember. Okay, so nurture equals environment, nature equals genes. Principles of how nature and nurture work. So what we know is that children acquire new knowledge based on what they already know and what they can do. So for example, most children learn to crawl before they learn to walk. Okay, so they have to have that knowledge of how to start crawling before they can walk. Now, some children are outliers and they never crawl, they just start to walk. But typically, most children learn how to crawl and then walk. Some children are deeply affected by certain stimuli where others are less affected. So, for example, that example I just gave you on the previous slide about the child who has their toys stolen from them in the classroom. So perhaps they're at daycare and that child comes and takes a toy from them. Some children are really affected. They get super angry. They become very upset. They start crying. Other children, it doesn't really matter. They go and play with something different. They're less affected. So, when children receive little human contact or they grow up in forceful families, they cannot make choices that would allow certain genetic tendencies to emerge. There's also sensitive periods that you will learn about throughout this class. Sensitive periods are lengthy time frames when children have heightened receptivity to environmental experiences. So as you read throughout the book, you will notice the authors say, hey, this is a sensitive period for this child. They're more receptive to things that are going on to them during this time. Issue 2, universality versus diversity. So when we look at universality, developmental changes occur in everyone, right? It's a universal thing. Every single person experiences changes at different points in their life. Okay, so my example is most children will learn to sit first, then they learn to walk, then they learn to run, etc. And it happens in that order. Okay, that's a universal thing. So if you have a child who's developing in Indonesia versus a child who's developing here in America, they're still going to learn how to do those things in that same order. Okay, then we look at diversity. So that's changes that are highly individual or differ between different groups. So examples for this is different cultures, and then the example between a boy and a girl growing up. Okay, so that can impact childhood development. Issue 3 has to do with qualitative versus quantitative. Okay, so qualitative are dramatic changes in development. We also refer to these as major reorganizations. So thinking about the term from science, metamorphosis, that's when organisms take existing states and convert them into entirely new forms. So to help you remember this, you can think about a caterpillar changing to a butterfly. That's like a drastic change. A tadpole to a frog. When we think about it in the context of childhood development, the drastic change is going from a baby or an infant all the way to an adult. And those quantitative changes are gradual progression. So we can also think about those as trends that happen throughout child development. We have small changes that happen in your behavior, your physical states, and your learning. So for example, growing taller, that happens at a slower rate. You don't go to bed as a child, you're 3 feet tall and wake up in the morning and you're 5 foot tall. Okay, so you grow taller throughout your whole entire life in small increments. Also, another example is learning about animal names, and then you can start learning about more complex things such as what the different animal kingdoms are. So something in particular in the text from chapter 1 for qualitative changes is that of the stage theory. So it's important for you to understand stage theory. So when we refer to the term stage, this is a period of developmental characteristics, a period of development that's characterized by an exact way of behaving or thinking. And then stage theory means is that as the individual progresses through a series of stages, they're qualitatively different from one another. So throughout this textbook, as you're learning about different stages in a child's life, there's essential founding characteristics for those different stages that children will experience from birth to adolescence. So these things happen. You can kind of imagine a pyramid. So you have to have those foundational stages that occur at the bottom before you can start building on and building on. So to go back to that example that I've used, a baby learns to sit up before they can learn to stand. So certain things in that baby's life have to happen in order for the next stage in their life to occur. Now, there are two prominent stage theorists. Okay, so a lot of their work, there's different developmental periods that are broken into different stages. And the first one is Jean Piaget. He's huge in the field of education. He proposed a stage theory in children's logical reasoning. Okay, so what he claimed is that children interact with the world primarily through trial and error. So to go back to that example that I gave about the child who touches the stovetop as his mother is cooking. Okay, so that's a trial and error exploration. The other theorist, the stage theorist, Erik Erikson, focused on major challenges that individuals face at different points in their lives. What he claimed is that people do not fully replace earlier developments with new modes of thinking. So instead, what he believed is that earlier struggles persist and sometimes intrude into new challenges that the child will face. While reading this book, it is extremely important for you to know the developmental periods. So here they are broken down. There are 5 major periods. So when I refer to infancy, I'm talking about from birth to age 2. Early childhood is when the child turns 2 all the way through the age of 6. Middle childhood is 6 to 10 years, early adolescence 10 to 14, and late adolescence is 14 to 18. So throughout this course, we will be covering from birth all the way to 18 years old. So when we think about these different periods, the 5 periods, infancy is marked with the newborn being completely dependent upon their caregiver. The baby has an arsenal of skills that elicit comfort and stimulation. Then we transition into early childhood. That's kind of marked with a lot of creativity and fantasy. As we move into middle childhood, children continue to play, but now they're capable of learning and from formal instruction. So the beginning of your kindergarten. This is going to be really impactful for you all as educators, as most of you are elementary educators. We move into early adolescence, which is the period of time where a child is transitioning both physically and in having interpersonal connections. And then we move into late adolescence, which is when the child has an intensified desire to make their own decisions, but they still require support in navigating mixed messages. Okay, so really going through a lot during those preteen and teenager years with navigating feelings and emotions. So for next class on Thursday, I want you to make sure that all of chapter 1 has been read. So if you didn't have time last week to read that, please, please, please make sure you read chapter 1. Review your notes from that chapter so you're better prepared for class. We are going to be doing a group activity that's going to be on Teams. So you should have been added to a Teams page. Please make sure you log on to Teams and you just know how to pull up that application on your device because you will need that for class on Thursday. If you need anything at all, please email me. And I look forward to seeing you virtually on Thursday. Thanks, everyone. Bye.